So I went and did a little something. Last weekend I picked up a Leica M11. Now I've had this camera in my hands now for about a week, and in today's video I wanted to do an initial impressions video because I always really enjoy making these videos because you kind of get that raw emotion of having a new piece of gear and then doing another review in like 6 months time and then kind of comparing the two. So in today's video I'm going to talk about all of my experiences moving from the M10 to the M11 based on just 1 week of ownership and update you in terms of how I'm feeling. Am I glad I bought it? Am I regretting it already? Well, in today's video, let's find out. If you're new here, my name is Goffy and welcome to the channel. I've been shooting Leica M cameras now for about 7 years in total. Had a Leica M240 for like 5 or 6 years, the Leica Q for then about 6 months, then I moved to the Leica M10 that I've just sold, having owned it for about a year, and I think it's a year and 2 months. So we sit here now then with a Leica M11. So first up then, let's talk about the build and design of this camera, and I clearly went with the chrome version. Now I actually did a poll over on Instagram before I bought it and asked people, what do you think? Should you go for black aluminium or the silver brass version? And I, to be honest, expected the black to win by a long way, but it was actually a little bit closer than I thought, but black did still win. Ultimately for me, I decided I didn't really mind, and it was more about what camera came up at a good price more than anything else. So because this is the silver brass version, this camera actually weighs the same basically as my M10. So I've not really had any weight saving moving up from the M10 to the M11. If I'd gone for the black model, there is a pretty good weight saving to be had. One design change that has been a little bit of a pain over this first week of getting used to the camera is the fact that the play and the live view button or function button on the M11 have been switched round. Trying to fight back against like a year's worth of muscle memory has been a bit of a pain this week, and I keep on clicking the wrong button. Then for me, the last change to this camera that is obvious from a design point of view is obviously this lack of a base plate on the bottom. It feels like we've kind of gone from one extreme to the other. The Leica M10, as fun and kind of reminiscent of film as it was, from a function point of view was arguably worse than just about every other camera brand on the market. And now we've got an implementation that feels like one of the best. I really like the way in which this works. It's super fast and convenient, and it just feels really nice as well. The only funny thing is, as good as it is, the battery's now so amazing that you find yourself rarely ever taking the battery out anyway. So you've now got a really good implementation, but you rarely find yourself actually going and using it. So away from the build and design then, what's it actually like to use? What's the shooting experience like? Now for me, one of the big standouts is that highlight weighted metering. I've been loving how good it is, and I've been swapping between multi-field and highlight weighted depending on the situation, and I think the multi-field setting is also better on here than it was on the M10. And then in like really tricky lighting conditions, I found myself quickly switching to highlight weighted and using that in the kind of more complex bright light scenarios where I really don't want to blow them highlights. Then one thing that people always seem really interested in with an M camera is, what does the shutter sound like? Well, in use, it is noticeably quieter. I don't know if you can even hear that. Feels a bit more dampened than the M10 does, and therefore just sounds a little bit quieter. The camera does feel a little bit slower to turn on than the M10, but the good thing is when the camera does turn on, it is ready to shoot. I found with the Leica M10 quite a bit, if you turned the camera on and then took a picture too quickly, it would end up looking something like this. It'd be super overexposed where the camera just hadn't had time to expose properly yet. Whereas with the M11, it definitely takes a little bit longer to turn on, but when you do take that first picture, you can almost guarantee it's going to be a good one. And I think what I'm going to end up doing with this camera is leaving it on standby more often and not actually switching it off, which is made easier by the fact that this battery is so much better than it used to be. So I used to go through 2 batteries on like a full day shoot, shooting around like Florence as an example. And so far this week, I've used this camera every day for the last 7 days, kind of casually, so only like a couple of hours at a time, and I'm still on the first battery. I've not actually charged this battery once yet, which is pretty impressive. And I've even got a spare included in the sale that, yeah, again, I'm yet to even use. Another thing that I've noticed when using this camera this week is that base ISO of 64. Now, when I'm doing my travel photography, I quite often like to take portraits wide open and make the use of Summilux lenses like this 35mm I've got on here now. Having a base ISO of 64 versus 100 just gives you that little bit more flexibility before hitting electronic shutter. And importantly, this camera has an electronic shutter. So for me, if I'm shooting a wide open portrait, there's not a lot of movement going on, so having an electronic shutter is actually super helpful. So back at home then, and away from the shooting experience, what is it actually like when you sit down and look at the photos in your Lightroom library? And first up then, importing the images, the thing that stands out is the file sizes are a lot bigger. As you'd expect, going from 24 up to 60 megapixels, the file size increases at the same speed. I was finding Leica M10 files would be somewhere between 25 and 35 meg, and I'm finding that files out of here are somewhere between 65 and 85 meg. There's a couple of outliers that are a little bit larger. So for me then, that actually means I've got a use for this function button on the top now. So far this week, I've been using that to cycle through the different megapixel modes. If I'm taking casual pictures of like the family and things like that, then I am not going to be using 60 megapixels. But I think for everything that is like assignment led, like the trip in Florence, then I do think I'll probably stick to 60 megapixels. Something that I want to do over the next couple of weeks is do a little bit of testing to see whether you do really see that extra stopper dynamic range that Leica claim by going down through those megapixel settings, to see if there is actually any value there or not. Color-wise, the colors are really quite different to the M10. When I had the Leica M11 back in London last year, I did do some side-by-side comparisons with the M10. And I'll chuck them up on the screen now, and you can see the M10 is kind of warm and green, whereas the M11 was cold and magenta. Now, I personally have a very strong preference towards warm files. I really like the warm look that the M10 gave, and I remember like leaving London and giving that camera back last year. That came away with me as a really big negative, that the files were cold and magenta. I think the reality is, now I own the camera, it's really easy to fix because they're raw files, and what I'll probably end up doing is just tweaking each of my presets a little bit to counter some of that magenta and cold and add a little bit of green and warmth back in. So I think the fix is going to be relatively simple, but it definitely stands out. The colours out of here are definitely different to the colours out of the M10. And when it comes to resolution, can I actually tell a difference when I'm sat at my computer screen? I'm not all that sure. So far though, I haven't really taken any pictures where I've done any aggressive cropping, and I know later in the year, well next year, I plan on doing some really big prints. I've got a couple of projects lined up that I want to do that involve printing really large, which is one of the reasons why I picked up this camera. But right now, I think sat here at my desk looking at my Lightroom library, there is minimal difference at the minute between the M10 and the M11. And I think this will be a really interesting one to look back on in 6 months when I do another review to see if the extra resolution is something that I end up really enjoying once I use the camera a little bit more. So then, have I come across any negatives so far? Now, I think the really obvious one is the price. This did cost me a lot to upgrade. The Leica M10 sold for around £3,000. This cost around £6,000, so the cost to upgrade was around £3,000, which is an incredible amount of money that could have gone on a lot of holidays or a completely different camera system. So it is definitely what feels like a bit of an irrational upgrade at the minute, but does that mean I'm not enjoying it? No, not at all. It just isn't a value proposition, and I never went into this expecting it to be. One thing that's really confused me with this camera was setting up the user profiles. The rest of the camera is super intuitive, but I actually had to go on Google and Google the instruction manual, because I couldn't be asked to get it out of the box, to work out how them user manuals worked. It was just a bit bizarre. I think now I've learnt it, it's not that bad and I understand it, but it just seemed really confusing for no real good reason. And that's where some of the settings like focus peaking was stored. And focus peaking is actually one of the other things I've struggled with a little bit this week. I think it's linked to the fact that when the live view punches in, it's now stabilized, and that stabilized view just looks really soft, and I actually find it harder to focus peak on here than I did on my M10, even though the screen on here is a lot better. If you're wondering what all the little numbers mean down at the bottom of the images, that links to my stackable preset collection. This is an example here. You take the raw, apply basic adjustment 4 and then tone curve 7, and you end up with this image. If you want a little bit more information about them, there's a link down in the description. So right now then, what are my closing thoughts 1 week in with the M11? Now I think when I'm out in the field, out shooting with the camera, all of the kind of benefits I'm really feeling at the minute. The better exposure methods, the base ISO being 64, the new battery life and the new battery door, the internal memory, all of that sort of stuff, I'm really realizing the difference. I think the thing that probably stands out at the minute is when I sit at my desk and I'm looking at the files on my computer. Right now, I'm not really seeing a massive jump up from the M10. And I'll be really interested in like 6 months time, because remember, I've only used this for a week. If in 6 months time, I'm gonna come back to this camera and I'm gonna be like, yes, I really, really like the files. And here's some examples where 60 megapixels really saved me, or the better ISO performance, or the 18 megapixel dynamic range. But currently, I'm yet to see it. I have zero regrets buying it, and I really look forward to using it more and more over the next few months. I'd be super interested to hear from you down in the comments if you have recently picked up an M11 having moved from an earlier iteration. If you've had an M9, M240, M10, and then you bought an M11, what was your experience like? How did you find it? If you've enjoyed this video though guys, please do not forget to like and subscribe. There is plenty more Fuji, Leica and travel content coming to the channel very, very soon. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Cheers. If you're here to tell me that this camera is not worth the money and it's super expensive and it's an outrageous purchase, then I agree with you. The red dot has just come off my lens. Did you hear it bounce? Yeah, there's my little red dot off my Summilux. So yeah, there's an interesting one for you. They aren't worth the money because they fall apart in your hands when you're recording a video.